1862 is the defining year in Minnesota's history. And I have very little memory of discussing the war in my public school classes. We talked about the Dakota genocide, we talked about the corrupt treaties, very little about the actual fighting. We talked about the Mankato hangings, but not the expeditions that followed, not the conditions on reservations, not the outright lies and the bigotry and the outright genocidal rhetoric that was dominant in Minnesota in 1862 and 1863. It was only when my friend Logan and I started exploring local history for a documentary series that we were working on that I began to realize how central this story is to our state and to the towns that Logan and I lived in. Our county was founded by Alexander Faribault, who himself was Dakota and white, and he fought in the U.S.-Dakota War. He had family on both sides of the conflict, and by understanding it through that local lens, I began to understand the impact that it had on everybody in the state of Minnesota, from a political level, from a legal level, from a personal level. Having a war in your backyard, or at the very least feeling like there's a war in your backyard, will have an indelible effect on how you view yourself and how you view your neighbor. And so with all of that in mind, there's a lot of trauma to deal with in this story. There's a lot of bloodshed. There's discussions of rape. There's a lot of violence. And of course, we will be talking about the genocide on the indigenous peoples of Minnesota. Joining me for that intense discussion is my friend Logan Ledman. Logan, this is Chapter 11 of North Country by Mary Lethert Wingard, and she titles it Cataclysm on the Minnesota.
Yeah, that's right. We've made it quite a ways from the first chapter, which started us thousands of years ago in the story of Minnesota history, and has brought us to this final chapter before the epilogue. Really, Mary Lethert Wingard has structured this entire book as a lead up to the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. And so as we read this chapter and talk about the events of this year, we need to remember everything that we've learned in these thousands of years of history that her book has covered. She could have written a book just about 1862, and it would have been great. It would have been very, compelling and engaging and revelatory. She very explicitly made the decision to make this book about how Minnesota was created begin with indigenous peoples coming into this area thousands of years ago, and having that story end with 1862. It's not, the book that we've been reading is not really, a full comprehensive history of the state of Minnesota. It's not that. Minnesota obviously continued to be a state well after 1862, and important events occurred in Minnesota afterwards. This book is not really a history of Minnesota. It's almost a history of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, because everything that she's written about has been playing into the trends and the forces that bring us to this incredibly traumatic and bloody moment. It's a long chapter.
Yeah.
We've been going through several long chapters recently in these episodes, but as always, it's my pleasure to do it with my friend Sam Temple. So let's get into it.
Yeah, we're just going to go back and forth for the next hour, introducing each other, and eventually we'll get to some of the meat of the story, but it'll be in this monologue where we have these broad ideas about Minnesota history with my friend Logan Ledman. Yes, and then I return now with 4 or 5 minutes of a monologue with my friend Sam Temple.
We don't want people to be confused about who's actually here. Right.
Yeah. No, we have similar voices, but I don't want to make that joke in case some people out there actually think we do. There's a.
I will say I checked when I did the audio editing on some of the earlier podcasts. That's why they sound a lot worse than this one. And I did at some points have trouble distinguishing between our voices. So apologies to anyone else out there for that problem. Actually, that also might explain some of the audio problems in the ones that I edited. But
you make a good point. You make a good point, Logan, that instead of focusing it on 1862, when you focus just on 1862 and you only do primary sources from the time, it can make it feel like this is inevitable. It can make it feel like this is a breaking point. It can make it feel like what happened in 1862 was going to happen. And the case that I think Wingard makes is fundamentally it did not. Things did not need to go this way. It was a series of small choices, of many small choices that led to this horrible violence and the desolation of Minnesota's culture, and not just the indigenous Minnesota culture, but the multicultural Minnesota that existed for hundreds of years. It completely destroyed this really unique thing that Minnesota had, beyond any foreseeable semblance of reconciliation there.
Well, let's talk about what actually happened.
Yeah.
Let's dive into it now. So we've laid the groundwork for many episodes now. But in the spring of 1862, as Mary Lethbridge Wingard writes, things have gotten very bad. Listeners might remember the thin strips of land along the Minnesota River that the Dakota people have been confined to by the treaties of 1851 and 1858. And generally, depending, when you go into the sources, they're overwhelmingly clear that the state of the people living on these reservations is near starvation. I've never seen anywhere a list of a quantitative analysis of how many people actually died of starvation. I don't know that it would be possible to get that. So there are people out there who actually will contest the idea that the Dakota living on reservations were in a state of starvation, because those numbers don't exist. As we go through, we might think of different parts of the story that are contested today by historians or pseudo-historians. This is one of those things, is the idea that the Dakota people living on the reservations in 1862 were not actually starving. Some people will say this. Mary Lethbridge Wingard provides a variety of sources, both from the Dakota people, from people on site of the reservations who were white, and from representatives of the United States government, who are all in agreement that the state of the Dakota people living on the reservations on the Minnesota River is certainly near starvation, certainly destitute, and that especially the old and the young are dying from their destitution. So that's the state of things in the spring of 1862, and then summer comes along. And the Dakota are depending on their payments, their annuity payments. We've talked about the promises of annuity payments from the treaties of 1851 and 1858 before. And one of the circumstances that we need to talk about as we talk about 1862 is the fact that 1862 is also the time when the American Civil War was rending the country apart on the national scale. Specifically, in spring of 1852, George McClellan was on his Peninsula campaign through southeastern Virginia in an attempt to attack the Confederacy's capital of Richmond. And George McClellan, if you know anything about him, you know that he was not the general who defeated the Confederacy because he was not a good general. And so by about April of 1862, the national mood about the Civil War was incredibly sour. George McClellan was bested in battle by a new general recently taken command of the Army of Virginia named Robert E. Lee, who had delivered some pretty harsh defeats on him defending the Confederate capital of Richmond. And so the Union Army is in disarray. The country had been expecting a quick resolution to the Civil War and was realizing a year into the conflict now that it was going to be a lot worse than they had ever anticipated. And it's starting to wreak havoc on the finances of the country as well. And so the annuity payments are not coming in to this far-flung outpost on the frontier. That doesn't mean the food and provisions, however, are actually at the Indian Agency. But the officials, including a very sinister fellow named Thomas Galbraith, refuses to hand over the provisions without the backing of proper gold money.
Right, and we talked a little bit about Galbraith in previous episodes, and at one point at his agency, at the upper agency, he was overcome with essentially the Dakota people on that reservation overtook the storefront, and then there was a widespread fear of violence. So missionaries had to come in to come and talk to the troops and do all that. Meanwhile, Wingard writes, Galbraith, apparently unnerved by weeks of unmitigated tension, barricaded himself in his office, getting drunk and rattled. His lieutenant,
Right.
Timothy Sheehan, testified, quote, "The agent never came out at all until the thing was over, and didn't assist me in any way, shape, or form," end quote. So that was the guy in charge of making sure that people didn't starve. Or as he put it, or as he believed his job, not that, but I guess keeping track of the agency, but not in a way that actually took care of other people. But needless to say, there was a rise in tensions in the beginning of 1862 because of these payment issues, because of some cruel words from agents across the state, including one at the Redwood Agency, where the war party got their refrain, "Let them eat grass," when they were told to. When they went to seek the food that was owed to them, they were told to eat grass. So they took that and turned it into a Marie Antoinette type line as sort of a rallying cry for their for what would eventually be the war. And the war started on August 17th, 1862. Wingard writes, 4 young Wahpeton braves from the Rice Creek Band were heading for home empty-handed, after scouring the countryside for several days in vain search of a deer or some small game to bring home to their village. And so there are just a lot of compounding events going on. Wingard continues, individual attacks on whites were rare but not unknown. In the past, punishment had fallen only on the perpetrators. Even the official outrage over Inkpaduta's infamous raids had been limited to that renegade band. Conceivably, the Acton murders might have been dealt with in a similar fashion, but circumstances had changed greatly since 1857. The rash actions of a few young men ignited a powder keg of anger, disillusionment, and desperation. On that fateful day, events had conspired to create what in today's parlance could be termed a perfect storm. And what those events were, we don't specifically know. What we do know is the Dakota men killed 7 white settlers. And there's debate about what specifically led up to those events, but regardless, that's what happened. That's what was reported, and that is what led to violence. And these young men were part of the members of the soldiers' lodges who were focused on the traditional Dakota way of life, on trying to restore sort of the warrior status, but also just the dignity and the what they perceived as a lack of willingness to stand up to the whites, to stand up to the United States. And that is what they decided to do. And they found a leader in Tayateduta, Little Crow. And Little Crow did not want war. He did not seek it out. But as we talked about in the previous podcast, he had lost his position of leadership. And also was basically prodded into agreeing. He was called a coward and decided not to take that, and essentially decided he'd rather die as a brave man than live as a coward. And from the beginning, Little Crow knew that there was very little chance that any uprising would result in a change in conditions, in a positive change in conditions for the Dakota people. Right. So he thought there was a chance, but a very, very slim chance. He knew that he was almost certainly heading into a suicide mission. And Wingard writes, and so Minnesota's Civil War began. Early on the morning of August 18th, the day after the attacks, Little Crow and the other hostiles swooped down on the Redwood Agency and systematically began killing their enemies. It is important to note, however, that in the first attacks, the Indians selectively targeted only agency employees, traders, and clerks, those deemed guilty of offenses against the Indians. No women, children, or mixed bloods were killed, suggesting that the offensive had not yet spun out of control. Still, when the attack was over, of the more than 80 people at the agency, 20 lay dead, 10 were taken captive, and the rest had taken flight in terror. And again, important to note that this is a small faction of the Dakota people who Little Crow is leading. Very few Dakota wanted war, and even smaller was the amount that were going to attempt to fight against the United States. So this is a small band who is going after this war, and we've talked about culturally what warfare was like in the traditional Dakota lifestyle, where it was largely skirmishes to get a small concession, or skirmishes to take back this bit of land, and then you'd live, in relative peace, and there'd be a skirmish here, and then you'd live in relative peace. Obviously, that is not how the United States perceived warfare, and it's certainly not something that the settlers of the time would accept. And very quickly, news of these events starts spreading across Minnesota.
Yeah, I want to complicate a couple things.
Please, complicate away.
Yes. So Little Crow, as a leader, what happens quickly after the first initial attacks is that it becomes very clear that he's not really a leader in the sense of being like a military commander as we would see it, or as even the United States of the time would see it. As in, the people that he is fighting alongside, he's a leader in the sense that he's a person who other people generally respect, and in that he has influence among other Dakota people. They respect him, and they'll listen to him if they believe he's making a good point. But they are not bound to follow his word or his orders in the way that a soldier under George McClellan was in Virginia. Every individual was fighting with their own motivations, with their own sense of what was right and what was wrong, with their own personal moral guide in terms of what warfare should look like to them. And that presented a lot of challenges to Little Crow as he attempted to, in some ways, lead the campaign, and in other ways had very little control over what other Dakota people were doing. Little Crow was personally not interested in killing women, children, or whites who had been friendly to the Dakota people. Wingard quotes him saying something to the effect of, "We should make war like the white man." If he believed in any potential positive good here outside of a suicide mission, it was that perhaps by a purely political, violent action, some kind of settlement could be made with a failing, United States government caught up in the Civil War, that maybe they could get a better deal for, permanent access to their land or something like that.
And possibly there was some talk of getting, more of their Dakota and Lakota brethren to join them.
Yep.
Against
Absolutely.
a weakened United States.
Exactly.
Something along those lines.
So yeah, absolutely. So that's his goal. But for some people, it is about venting the rage of that's been built up in these meetings of the soldiers' lodges, and some people don't make distinctions between whites, and within the first week, the vast majority of the bloodshed happens within that time span, within that first week, when hundreds of white settlers are killed. The vast majority of them unarmed, probably a majority of them women and children. And Little Crow isn't like giving orders that this is what's going to happen. It's not part of a military strategy. It is the individualized result of these decades of trauma that's been forced onto these people and their parents and their grandparents and their grandparents' parents. And it finally breaks in all of these individuals who go out and commit acts of violence.
Right, and there are many stories of those acts of violence, and you can tell that it's disorganized because you will hear cases of many people being killed, and at the same time you will hear cases of kindness shown, of courtesy shown to whites who were previously allies, of some protection from mixed bloods, but then other mixed bloods are taken as captives or coerced into being part of the fight. That happened quite frequently as well, where if you were Dakota or if you were mixed blood, you were essentially drafted, given no choice. You will either die or join us. And
that's what Joseph Godfrey claims happened.
Exactly. Or specifically, Daniel Faribault as well. We talked about Alex's kinship. Daniel Faribault was Alex's nephew. And his claim was also that he was coerced into being part of the fighting. And there's a broad spectrum of distinction between the violence that occurred, what different individuals felt was noble, felt was right, felt was just, and everyone had different goals. That's the other thing about not being a unified political group or a unified army, is some people thought this was a suicide mission just to die as warriors and get as much vengeance as possible, and some thought it was a political act that had the potential to make change, to live on, and it's hard to know, especially with the decades of erasure that has taken place with the Dakota narrative, the lack of interest in actually understanding the truth at the time, and there was a lot of fear mongering. But here are the facts that we know. Wingard writes, hundreds of innocent people died in the rampage, estimates ranging between 400 and 1,000 victims. Survivors hid in the woods or crawled on their knees through the tall prairie grasses, quaking at every sound as they struggled toward the relative safety of Fort Ridgely. Images of slain husbands, wives, children, and friends burned upon their memory. More children and babies died along the way from thirst and exposure. At first, the Indians had the advantages of surprise and disbelief at the scope of the uprising. When word of the attacks reached Fort Ridgely, Captain John Marsh, in command of the post, set forth with a small party of troops, just 46 green enlistees, along with an interpreter, to quell the trouble at the agency. The captain assured his men that the sight of the soldiers would cow them as it had so many times before. Hours later, nearly all the men, including the captain, were dead. Fort Ridgely itself, bursting with terrified refugees and only 40 remaining inexperienced soldiers to defend them, barely survived an assault 2 days later. At New Ulm, a German settlement, a war party of between 300 and 600 braves laid siege to the barricaded town. The citizens, under the leadership of Charles Flandreau, managed to repel 2 separate attacks, but at great cost. 26 defenders died, and most of the town was reduced to smoking ruins. So many people, whether or not they were directly involved in the violence, mainly homesteaders, people in small villages, they were leaving. They were leaving their homes. So for the individuals who wanted the white man gone, to some extent, they felt like they were achieving that, but at the cost of hundreds of victims. So the state of Minnesota had an emergency on its hands, and the governor, Alexander Ramsey, Bluff Alec, you might recall, he calls on Henry Sibley, the moccasin Democrat, who had a deep understanding of Dakota culture, of respect, and he was largely respected among the Dakota people. And Sibley also needed to prove himself to the white citizens of Minnesota, because they had largely lost respect for him in the financial crisis that plagued Minnesota in the late 1850s. Interesting choice of Sibley to run a military expedition, seeing as he had no military experience. He was rejected from West Point. So this was also his chance to play soldier for a little bit. And let's keep in mind, even I believe earlier in 1862, there were potential threats of uprising with the Ojibwe. And for years prior to this, there were small skirmishes and threats and all of this. And most of the time, just a show of force, or just to show that, hey, we're taking this seriously, would be enough to quell the issue. So that's where this mass bloodshed immediately out of the gate really was unheard of with the state of Minnesota. Even in Padutu's raid had an incline, you know. It started out one way and it ended up getting bloodier and bloodier. So right. the ramping up had a sense of warning to it. But for whites, especially, you know, for example, New Ulm was largely German immigrants. German immigrants were purposely kept in the dark about the state of things in Minnesota. Certainly had no real preparation for this event unless they still had a standing army or militia following the Paduta raids. But Sibley really is tasked with an impossible challenge, and he fails. I mean, for lack of, he isn't a good military commander, and he was very slow. People mocked him for being reactive. He did not try to anticipate any of the Dakota's moves, any of the war party's moves, and he had very few actual tactical victories. But part of that also was he understood Dakota culture. He understood, especially if these were the warriors of the warriors, they would be a formidable opponent. So for a long time, all Sibley's forces could really do was bury bodies and clean things up, follow the war party wherever they went. So that did not help his popularity. That did not help assuage the fears and concerns and the anger of the people, the white people of Minnesota. And part of that is the destruction of property that's taking place. We talked about New Ulm being razed. Often they would go into homesteads and farmhouses and take what they could, take whatever food or weapons or anything that they could find that would be of value. They looted the towns of Forest City and Hutchinson, and it was very difficult in the southwestern areas of Minnesota, which were largely farming communities. And very quickly, the other bands of the Dakota, the Peace Party, as they came to be called, but also just the Dakota who had absolutely nothing to do with what was going on, very quickly tried to separate themselves and made a point of condemning and setting themselves apart from Little Crow's war party that he was leading. The war party seemed to understand how far things were really taken, and the fighting went on for about a month, when things came to a head at Wood Lake. So there were skirmishes here and there, but largely it was the war party attacking civilians. They had a couple attempts on military forts that were ultimately unsuccessful. At Birch Coulee, they came across a burial party, just by coincidence, and attacked them for a while until Sibley's forces eventually showed up after 30-some hours. And on September 22nd, they came across Sibley's forces at Wood Lake. And Wingard writes, in the words of Hide Nyanka, the son-in-law of Chief Wabasha, quote, "We may regret what has happened, but the matter has gone too far to be remedied. We have got to die." And this is about a force of 300 going against Sibley's 1,600 men. And it was a skirmish and largely the last stand of the war party. Following the fight at Wood Lake, many of Little Crow's men escaped to the west, to what is now North and South Dakota and beyond, to regroup and make a plan from there. And we will return to the war party later on. But for now, let's talk about the reaction that took place among the white settlers across the state. Sure.
So, like we've been talking about, there were a variety of different actions that Dakota people took, attacking towns, attacking military bases, attacking civilians. And all of those circumstances, as the stories spread out east towards St. Paul, were inflated in magnitude pretty much beyond belief. And the you can go in, and Gary Clayton Anderson's Massacre in Minnesota, a recent book, does a really exemplary job of doing this, kind of continuing some of the work that Winger did. Anderson looked at specific claims that were made by newspapers in St. Paul, and things that became popular wisdom about the U.S.-Dakota War. For example, the ideas that the civilians were scalped, the ideas that they were like torn apart. There was a lot of stories about babies being nailed to the sides of fence posts and stuff like that. In fact, actually, just about a month ago, I was on Facebook, and there was a discussion about renaming a high school named after Henry Sibley somewhere. And one woman commented something saying that Sibley was justified because Dakota people had been nailing babies to fence posts in the U.S.-Dakota War. And Anderson very clearly lays out in his book, from on-the-field journal diaries from the U.S. forces going onto these scenes of death afterwards, that the killings were, they were brutal. They were murdering another human being, but there were no recorded instances of something like babies being ripped out of women and nailed to fence posts. There were no recorded instances of brutal mutilations beyond how Dakota people would traditionally mark a dead body, which was a slit to the throat, which was construed sometimes as a decapitation. But there's this brutality that takes place, and it gets turned into these lies out east. And that's combined with the fact that 20,000 people, is it 20,000 or 40,000 people, Sam?
I believe it's closer to, I believe it's 40 to 50,000.
I think it's 40,000. Yeah, it's 40,000 people become refugees from from the western settlements.
So that's essentially the entire population of the county I live in.
Yeah, yep. It's it was something like 20% of the state, maybe even half of the state. It's an enormous percentage of the state that is now taking up refuge in St. Paul or in Faribault, in eastern cities. And it's essentially the western half of Minnesota is depopulated. It's an enormous event, and the stories are compounded by a couple episodes. We talk about the new idea about race that was politicized in the years leading up to the Civil War in Minnesota, and so these tales about violence get mixed in together with the new violently non-white racism of the sort of the Yankee elites, and it becomes genocidal, genuinely genocidal, where there's definitely in a lot of aspects of the United States' Indian policy, there's debate can be had between people of good faith as to whether various actions were genocides.
What happened in Minnesota gives a lot of other places across the country benefit of the doubt. Because if genocide wasn't a word that was used back then, extinction was, and it was used frequently. Extinction, extermination. Those were the words of the day in Minnesota, and it wasn't just the extremists. It wasn't just the far-flung folks. It was the people who were scared to be in their homes, scared to be in the state of Minnesota, the folks who thought that the only place indigenous people have is consigned to the archaeological records.
And the governor.
Sibley at least tempered it with saying, I'll just drive them beyond the borders of the state or to hell. So he at least had the option. But across the state, people were calling for the extermination of the Dakota people. And as we'll see later on, they didn't make a distinction between Dakota and Ojibwe and Winnebago, and it didn't matter if they were or were not part of the fighting.
I really want to emphasize that last point. Again, it's so crazy to look at the response that we're going to talk about and remember, as Winter points out, maybe 1,000 Dakota people overall take place in the fighting. Maybe several hundred are active, really committed warriors, and the population of Dakota people in Minnesota is like 7,000 human beings. So the vast majority are do not participate in this disorganized, sudden, spontaneous outburst. Spontaneous within the context of these decades we've talked about. But you understand what I mean. And further, Dakota people themselves really played a much larger role in ending the conflict than Henry Sibley did. As Sam said, he was not an aggressive general or anything like that. In fact, it's hard to really say that he was a bad general because he didn't really do anything in this specific campaign. They didn't meet up with the Dakota until, like Sam said, September 22nd. And at that point, the Peace Party had already completely drenched the momentum of the Dakota soldiers, and they had already been turned away by the Sisseton and Wahpeton.
Right. So tell us a little bit more about the Peace Party, Logan.
Yeah, sure. So we're talking about the continuation of civil conflicts that began before the war. As in, there's these young people primarily who form the soldiers' lodges, and there's also the older civil government types. You can think of them as, the chiefs who are older, who have lots of experience with the United States government, and generally speaking, who acceded to acculturation programs in various ways, trying to achieve a balance between the forced assimilation policies of the United States and retaining important what they could of Dakota culture and heritage. And they don't go away when the young men of the soldiers' lodges primarily of the Minnesotans tribe begin the actual war itself. And the civil chiefs of the Sisseton and Wahpeton, who are in the upper Minnesota River Valley, are, they're in not necessarily a better situation than the Minnesotans, but they're just in a different material circumstance than the Minnesotans on the lower Sioux reservation. And so the particular forces and insults that we talked about at the beginning of the episode, we were mostly talking about the Minnesotans. Although the Sisseton and Wahpeton were also starving, were also in a state of starvation, but they had a different history with the United States government, just a long-standing different context. And that resulted in the Sisseton and Wahpeton people, a couple hundred people from the Sisseton and Wahpeton groups came down and joined in the fighting. But the vast majority were opposed, and the chiefs, the leaders, explicitly actually threatened a civil war, really threatened to fight against Little Crow when Little Crow came to them in September after Birch Coulee seeking their military assistance. And that also gave time for the members of the Minnesotans tribe itself that were opposed to the war, including chiefs like Wabasha, who was a incredibly influential man, who had influence at least equal to, if not more than, Little Crow himself, who was opposed to the war, and who secretly worked with Henry Sibley, sent messages to General Sibley at that time, Colonel Sibley, working to effect a peace, negotiating for the end of the war. And they, at one point, the peace party, which included men like Wabasha, like Wakute, like Teope, all members of the Minnesotans band, of the Minnesotans tribe, actually did an incredible amount of work protecting hostages, white settler hostages, while they were in Dakota custody.
Yeah.
And their efforts, combined with the efforts of the Sisseton and Wahpeton, in a very real way, come to stick the Dakota War Party in place, and probably are more influential in ending the war than Henry Sibley. But to the rest of Minnesota, they're all just Indians.
Right. Really, really well summarized. A very complex story there. So in a lot of the ways, this is much less of Minnesota Civil War and more of a Dakota Civil War. The thing that they're just fighting over is the white people.
It's hard to say what this is, by the way.
Yeah.
I just want to quickly say, it's hard to, you call this a U.S. Dakota War is what we've been calling it. And that's a generally accepted term. And that gives you the idea that the Dakota nation, the Dakota Oyate, came together and agreed to begin a war against the United States. And that's not how it occurred. That's not what it was. But the U.S. certainly did effect a war after this on the Dakota Oyate. Mm-hmm. That's true. So...
And it's not just an uprising where the Dakota people unprompted decided to revolt.
Right.
There were direct actions, the holding back of food and provisions, the constant cheating and lying with treaties. So for a long time, the Sioux uprising, or the Dakota conflict is sometimes what it was called, and that could sometimes soften it, and it puts all of the verbiage, all of the action on the Dakota people, when it was very much, there was quite a bit of U.S. provocation that went into this. So you're right, this terminology is incredibly messy. Let's steer back into the narrative, and this isn't something that I want to steer back into. But one of the major accusations you'll hear about is sexual assault and rape on white women and children. And Logan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the United States military officials and the religious figures who were brought in to interview the victims made the assertion that every woman was raped. Is that am I remembering this correctly? Is that essentially what happened?
Yes, it is. So this is perhaps the most complicated and hard to understand
I just
question.
do this. I tee it up and then I throw it to you because then you can talk about the complicated stuff and I'll just read from the book. And so I've set this up nicely for myself.
Great, good work. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, have fun.
Because there's so much going on here. On the one hand, first of all, all of the military officials and government officials, like you mentioned, talking about rape, cannot use that word. In that the cultural mores of the 1860s meant that essentially literally could not talk about women being raped, about the idea of a woman having sex before marriage, because the idea was so ingrained in especially the genteel culture that Sibley was trying to ingratiate himself into. The idea was if a woman gives up her purity before marriage, in any way her reputation is destroyed. Her womanhood is lost. And so to say that someone has been raped was to accuse them of having given up their womanhood, their femininity in some way. But on the other hand, they were fully willing to say that the Dakota had been rapists. And Stephen Riggs conducts a number of interviews with women on the who had been held hostage by the Dakota. And after he holds these interviews, he has a discussion with Sibley. Now, there's no written testimony from any of these interviews. There's no written testimony of the conversation between Riggs and Sibley. What I can say is that it becomes clear that Riggs and Sibley believe that nearly every woman between the ages of, say, 14 to 40 was raped. Which is not to say that it was their belief that every Dakota man was a rapist. Nor that every woman outside of those ages was raped. But that is their belief.
Right. Now, even think about the 21st century. How difficult it is for women to come forward, to have the support that they need, to be believed to begin with, and then to actually prove it, and this is 1862. So all of those steps are unbelievably more difficult than they are right now. And right now it is unbelievably difficult. And that's where we need to really be cautious in how we tell the story. Because we need to be aware not only of how readily these officials will lie about the outrages of the Dakota, we also need to be aware of the difficulties, the social mores, all that stuff that might prevent a proper discussion of sexual assault from taking place. And that, I believe, is part of the reason that this war is so rarely talked about, that the aftermath is usually glossed over, is because there are no clean answers. It is unsatisfying and frustrating as an adult to try and understand what's going on. Trying to explain a fraction of this to a 6th grader or a 9th grader, it's not going to happen, not because they're unable to understand, just because it's not understandable. There aren't any good answers for any of this.
Yeah.
All we know is that these actions and these accusations led to actions that we do know happened.
Right.
But these gaps make it very difficult.
So I'll give my personal opinion. Personally, I agree with Gary Clayton Anderson. I think eventually makes the conclusion that most of the white women between the ages of 14 and 40 had been sexually assaulted in some way in their captivity. Again, adding to the complexities of things here is where do these actions come from? Why does this take place? There, in the episode, in some of the writings that Sam and I have done, thinking about the war, we've kind of classified two cultural things leading to this among the Dakota. One, and I think the most prominent one is the fact that for decades now, Dakota women have been sexually assaulted by white and mixed race traders and Indian agents, and coerced into prostitution and marriages, to the point that there's a story that historian Anderson tells that one of the Dakota ceremonies is a virginity ceremony of sorts, essentially in which young women who have not had sex yet partake. And the population of adolescent women who had not had sex yet was so depleted by the ongoing sexual assault by white officials in the 1850s that the ceremony no longer took place. There were not enough adolescent young women who had not been sexually assaulted. And that contributed to a depopulation of Dakota women overall. There were a lot more Dakota men than Dakota women by 1862, as you know, a lot of the times as a result of forced marriages to white officials. And the creation of soldiers' lodges is the other thing, in which so civil government was mixed gender. It was democratic among the Dakota, and women held an important role in deciding the affairs of the community. The soldiers' lodges were all male. They were, you might remember, permanent creations of what had originally been a temporary hunting trip, and the men were the hunters, and so the organization that came out of these temporary hunting and policing groups were all male. And as they held more and more political influence, women held less and less political influence. And Gary Anderson points out how the work of a lot of ethnologists have pointed out how when there's a large imbalance in political power between men and women in a society, rape culture flourishes. And that is the kind of circumstance that the destruction of Dakota society by the U.S. government created. So I tend to believe that it's possible that the majority of women who had been held in captivity were sexually assaulted in some way. Doesn't mean all of the Dakota men were rapists. It doesn't mean that the people accused of rape did not deserve a trial.
And all of this only took place because all of this information that we're receiving is because of the testimony, the sort of the makeshift testimony. I pause before even calling it testimony, because I think it could hardly qualify as that. From both the Dakota men and the white settlers, it's all very flimsy stuff, simply because Sibley didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't care about what he was doing, because vengeance was what he was looking for, not the truth. And how he decided to exact that vengeance, how he pursued facts in his own way, and how he determined who was going to be executed will be discussed further in part 2 of this chapter next week on North Country.